that, you could be around 64% of GDP in terms of government spending. So if we consider total government spending is around 44% of GDP, which is absolutely insane. And then if you include tax expenditures and price regulation, the size increases to 64%. Because when you look at the USSR, for example, government spending as a percentage of GDP growth in the USSR, which was a communist dictatorship essentially, was 50 to 70% of GDP. Canada is committing economic suicide as Justin Trudeau's immigration plan creates an economic implosion. And not only that, Trudeau's government now accounts for more than 64% of GDP when it comes to government spending, which is just absolutely insane. More than 60% of Canada's GDP, of the economy, is now government. And just to compare that, the USSR was 50 to 70% of GDP. So absolutely insane. So let's get into this. Let's first start off with a clip from Freeland where she literally acknowledges what is going on. This is just going to infuriate a lot of you. It infuriated me.
Documents obtained by Canadian press show your government was warned that housing construction had not kept up with population growth, largely because of Canada's immigration targets. Why did your government not heed that warning and lower immigration levels?
Thank you for the question, Simon. And let me say this. As a country, Canada is probably the country in the world which is the most welcoming of new Canadians, which is the most welcoming of immigrants. And as finance minister, I have to say that is a huge economic strength.
So as finance minister, you heard directly from Chrystia Freeland's mouth that is a huge economic strength. So let's actually dive into the data and actually see if it is an economic strength, starting off with productivity. So productivity in Canada is absolutely tanking. This is the opposite of what you would like to see when you have immigration this high. If you have immigration this high and you have the economic growth to support it, productivity would absolutely be surging, but that's not what's happening at all. As we know, Canada does not have the economic strength or the economic growth to deal with it. The economy is stagnating, and that's a best case scenario. Most of us know on this channel that the economy is deep in a recession right now. By the time the central planners, the politicians, the mainstream media realize how bad it is, we'll already be going into a depression by then. And it's unfortunate, but I believe we are heading into a depression now. And I believe you're seeing signs of that everywhere. A lot of people won't accept it. They say, Luke, no way is this a depression. Yeah, go look at the job lines at McDonald's and Tim Hortons and Loblaws. I mean, these are literally Great Depression type things. Go to your local downtown core where there's homeless people shooting up drugs everywhere. And we also have a mental health crisis. So it's absolutely crazy what is going on. But Trudeau's government, they actually knew about this. Trudeau botched immigration surge, Canada's top bank economists say. So let's see what the bank economists are saying. Canada's current immigration policy, among the most open in the world, is now causing economic damage and needs to be reconsidered, according to the country's top economists. And guys, how many times over the past couple of years have I said about this immigration plan being a total disaster for the economy? And a lot of people were saying, no, Luke, you're way off on that. This immigration thing is great for the country. We need immigrants, and we do to a certain extent. But if you don't have that economic growth to support that, you are literally causing economic suicide. And that's exactly what's happening in Canada. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's decision to dramatically increase immigration and allow a flood of temporary workers and international students without providing proper support has created a laundry list of economic problems, including higher inflation and weak productivity. Chief economists at Canada's biggest bank said Thursday during a wide-ranging panel discussion in Toronto. And then this economist from TD said, frankly, I'm surprised we screwed it up because we sit in such a privileged position in Canada. But the reality is, when you look at the immigration surge that we've seen, a lot of that immigration surge has been non-permanent residents. It's been people on student visas and different things like that. So these are people on the very low end of the income scale that we're bringing in. These are the workers that the oligarchs love. And to a certain degree, that actually keeps inflation lower. And that acts as a disinflationary thing, because if you've got workers coming into Toronto, let's say, that is a place where a lot of immigrants go, or Calgary or Vancouver, then that means you've got a lot of demand from workers. And we've seen that precisely with the people in these long job lines outside Tim Hortons, Loblaws, places like that. Think about what that does to wage pressure. It alleviates it massively. And it's alleviating it for who? The oligarchies, like the grocery store chains, like the big banks, like the fast food giants, all these different companies. It's not really helping small businesses at all. It's mainly a play for the oligarchs. And you've just got to consider as well that Trudeau also quietly, I think a lot of Canadians didn't even realize this, lowered the bar for citizenship requirements. And immigrants need citizenship in order to what? To vote in an election. So it's impossible to ignore the argument that Trudeau has brung people in and has literally just brought people over who will likely vote for him, especially if you look at the communities that have a high percentage of immigrants and which way they voted in past elections. It's easy to make that connection and connect the dots there. So I think there's a plan that is far larger than people might realize that these politicians and central planners have. And you have to remember, guys, that Freeland and Trudeau, they are in a privileged position and they do not see any of the bad effects of immigration, right? They're living in their mansions, they're getting chauffeured place to place. They are not confronted daily by the economic realities of these people who are coming to Canada in search of a better life. They've been promised these things and it's just not the reality. I find it disgusting because it's just such a disservice to even the immigrants to allow them to come over, this many of them, promising them a better life when actually if they just stayed in India, for instance, which is a country that is actually on the rise, whereas Canada is a country on the decline, they're likely going to have more economic opportunity there, which is unbelievable to say, but it's the way it is. So Canada's economy falling behind US and growing 10x faster per capita. Canada's economy falling behind US growing 10x per capita faster. So basically the US is growing much faster than Canada, as you can see on this chart. So you basically got Canadian and US gross domestic product per capita of the past decade in US dollars. You can see that these were coupled kind of close together in 2012, 2013, and then boom, they just completely decoupled from each other. I mean, they follow similar trends, as you can see, but Canada has been way down. It has actually seen GDP per capita decline, and it's barely back up to levels in 2012. You've only got to think of inflation and how bad we've had inflation, and the shared wealth and prosperity in this country is not growing. So what does that mean? That means the standard of living is in fact collapsing. So the past decade saw GDP per capita grow 10x faster in the US. In fact, Canada has persistently lagged the US over the past decade. Over the past 10 years, the country saw 4.3% growth according to the World Bank calculations. That works out to less than a tenth of the growth observed in the US, which saw GDP per capita rise 47.4% over the same period. Canada has made international headlines for its aggregate GDP growth, but rarely have people looked at how that looks adjusted for population. And when you look at that GDP growth, I mean, it is such a broken number, and this comes from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and it says estimating the true size of government in Canada. And this basically comes to the conclusion that, you know, you could be around 64% of GDP in terms of government spending. So if we consider total government spending is around 44% of GDP, which is absolutely insane still. And then if you include tax expenditures and price regulation, the size increases to 64%. I'm going to leave a link in the description so you can go through this. It's incredibly interesting because when you look at the USSR, for example, government spending as a percentage of GDP growth in the USSR, which was a communist dictatorship essentially, was 50 to 70% of of GDP. And this is what's happening. I mean, I believe everything is in cycles. We're slowly in these cycles are slow, but we're always in these different cycles of politics, different cycles of economic growth, different cycles of economic contraction, and all the rest of it. And I believe that we are actually going down the slippery slope towards that, where you have lack of incentives, like people have no incentives to work in the current economy. So that can mean that they then go to being more corrupt, because that's the only way to get ahead, is now to take a bribe and become corrupt. People are just trying to get ahead at the end of the day. But when you have a lack of incentive, this is what happens to productivity. You see productivity that goes down. And I want to show you this because this is really interesting too. If you look at countries by the amount of people that belong to the top 1% of wealth holders, you can see where wealth actually is held. And you can see that it's the United States. The United States is still the most prosperous country to live in today. And you can see that Canada has fallen even behind my home country, the UK, England. You know, the UK has had significant problems, but let me tell you, the UK in the 1990s and in the 2000s was doing exactly the same thing that Canada is doing right now when it comes to immigration. And now the UK is just a country that I almost don't even recognize. And that's what a lot of you Canadians probably think of your own country here in Canada, is that you just do not recognize this country anymore. And that's because Canada is slowly losing its identity. And it was a young country anyway, but when countries lose their identity, well, I don't even have to tell you what happens, because it is never a good thing when that happens. And that is exactly what's happening in Canada. So you can see that also France surprisingly ranks number 3, and even China. But you can see Canada is lagging behind, so is Australia. And when you look at GDP per capita, because this number is often used as it was in those articles that we just went through, you have to bear in mind that GDP per capita is including 64% of government spending, guys. So if you're not at the end of the money printing machine, which is the government, you're not benefiting from this. So the GDP per capita, if you look at the private sector and if you work in the private sector, has absolutely collapsed. And that is why we are heading into this depression right now. And that is why most mainstream economists, most central planners, they don't recognize this and they don't see it, because they are completely out of touch with reality. They don't know what is going on. As Freeland says there in that tweet from Sue, she doesn't even answer the question, and she just points to the fact that immigrants provide economic strength, which is a total myth. It's a total myth, as we're seeing play out right now in Canada. But again, as I said to you, when you're being chauffeured around, when you don't even live in the real world, how is it possible that you're going to see any of these things? And when you surround yourself with people that reinforce all your biases, which are completely wrong, then you end up being like these central planners, which are the stupidest people in our economy to look at and say, oh yeah, these people know what they're talking about. A 10-year-old could do a better job than Freeland, because it's all these biases that they have that drive their behavior and why they say what they do. Now, it's impossible to say today that they don't recognize that we have a massive problem in Canada in terms of an economic problem with this immigration. And obviously they are ignoring that for a reason. And we have to all stand here and kind of guess why that reason is. But it's hard to come to a realization that it's not economic suicide that they're trying to commit right now. And why would they be trying to do that? And that's the question that I want to leave you with, and maybe let me know in the comments, because I'd be interested to know. So anyway, if you're looking for a VPN, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like this video here. You might also like this playlist here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.